Well, that's where I am. Beautiful 3-story mansion.
Oh, you're going to visit it.
There you go.
She wants to see the secret places.
I do.
All right, well, good evening, everyone. And welcome to the next edition of our guest speaker series here at the Holland Land Office Museum. Thanks for braving the heat wave to come on out, but we've got it nice and cool for you in here, so don't worry. So we're very pleased to have Daisy Nicosia here from the Seneca Falls Historical Society. She wears many hats there. When she sent me her bio, I was like, well, that's a lot of titles. So she's a curator, archivist, and researcher there. So we're very pleased to have her here, and she's going to be talking about the early settling of New York, and hopefully we'll all learn something tonight. So take it away, Daisy.
Perfect. How are we doing tonight?
Good.
Perfect. Let me make sure my button is doing good. Very good. I promise I won't blind anyone with this, but no promises. So, as he said, my name is Daisy Nicosia, and I'm with the Seneca Falls Historical Society. And today we are talking about the settling of early New York, more specifically through land grants and land purchases. Which, before we even talk about the European settling of this area of New York, we of course need to talk about the Haudenosaunee. The Haudenosaunee, or the people of the Longhouse, were members of a confederacy of Aboriginal nations known as the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So originally there were only 5 nations, the Seneca, Cayuga, and in the early 18th century it became known as the 6 Nations. The Haudenosaunee were a part of the Iroquois language family and are actually linguistically related to neighboring nations in the Great Lakes area. And before contact with early Europeans, the Haudenosaunee were horticulturists, living year-round in stockaded villages with several hundred people. Their social structure was based on matrilineal principles, and later a lot of women suffrage leaders would actually be inspired by these principles in their individual movements. The system was a lot different from the ones that Europeans were accustomed to, who worked under more of the patriarchal system. So in this case, with the Haudenosaunee, all of the lineage came from the mother's side rather than the father's side. And this next image here, you can see sort of the array of where these original nations would have been sort of settled in. More western New York was with the Senecas. Where I'm from in Seneca Falls would have been the Cayugas. And then more east you have the Onondagas, the Oneidas, the Tuscaroras in this small area here. And then sort of the eastern part of the state would have been the Mohawks. And as you can see in this image, most of New York State was the territory of the Haudenosaunee, excluding sort of downstate and a smaller portion near the Seneca. So, for example, the Seneca, you had the Erie, and then more downstate, we had the Delaware, the Paspatuck, the Mohegans, and the Abegani. And similar to what happened with the Haudenosaunee years later, a lot of these tribes were displaced when European settlers first came to this land. And sort of that fact brings us to the early New York State, the Providence of New York. The Providence of New York was officially founded in 1664 when English forces captured what was then New Amsterdam and the Dutch colony of New Netherlands. And the Dutch had originally formed this colony in 1614, which included portions of present-day New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Connecticut, and Delaware. So a big chunk of the eastern coast. And this colony and New Amsterdam were both renamed to New York after its new proprietor, James II, who was the Duke of York and the Duke of Albany. And the province of New York really thrived during this time. Its economy was strengthened by Long Island and the Hudson Valley Agriculture. And in conjunction with trade at the Port of New York, the colony was considered the breadbasket and lumberyard for the British sugar colonies in the Caribbean. On November 1st, 1683, this province was divided into 12 separate counties, which 2 of those would actually later on actually become part of Massachusetts. So we of course have Suffolk County, I cannot pronounce things today, which makes up most of Long Island today, New York County, which makes up the borough of Manhattan, Kings County, which is right here, this little small area, which is Brooklyn. Richmond is considered Staten Island. Queens, of course, is the borough of Queens. Westchester, which is sort of the Bronx today. Dutchess, or now spelled with a T, sort of formed both Dutchess County and Putnam County. Orange County later became Rockland County. Ulster County, which is right up here, this very big one. Parts of it were moved to form Sullivan County and parts of both Delaware and Greene County as well. And then of course we had Albany, which was this very big one up here. And it was originally much larger and included all of the land north of the county and extends up to the northern limits of the state. So Albany was massive. And then of course you had Dukes County and Cornwall County, which both of them ended up becoming parts of Massachusetts. So you can't really see them on this map, but Dukes County would have been many small coastal islands. One of those islands including Nantucket, if you know where Nantucket is. And then Cornwall is actually a part of Maine today, ironically enough. Became part of Massachusetts in 1692 and later became part of Maine. And besides Albany, this is sort of what the colony of New York would have looked like leading up to the Revolutionary War. Now, New York played a very important role in the Revolutionary War. I say this, but I'm not really going to go deeply into depth as to what New York did during the war, because that would probably take another hour, hour and a half, and that could be a whole presentation in and of itself. So instead, I wanted to highlight the Haudenosaunee involvement in the Revolutionary War. So the Six Nations originally wanted to remain neutral during the war. But however, as the Revolutionary War progressed, the Confederacy really became divided. Some wished to side with the British, especially the Mohawk tribe, as they had a past relationship with Britain during the fur trade and the French and Indian War. And the British actually attempted to sweeten the deal by promising to protect tribal lands in exchange for Haudenosaunee support during the war. While some nations of the Confederacy, like the Oneida, wanted to have a closer relationship with those local colonists and really wished to side with their neighbors. And because of this really ended up sort of breaking down the ties between these individual nations. And yeah, so I lost my train of thought there, sorry. It was actually the Mohawk raids that often led to retaliatory attacks against the Continental Army. An example of one of these attacks all of us may know is the Clinton campaign, Sullivan-Clinton campaign, which was initiated by General George Washington in 1779. And essentially George Washington dispatched General John Sullivan into Haudenosaunee lands with a mission to destroy villages, crops, and other resources. And it was successful enough that some of the Haudenosaunee still call Washington the town destroyer to this day. The Revolutionary War, unfortunately, would not end well for America's indigenous people, regardless on what side they fought on. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 did not end the bloodshed that would continue to take place between the Native Americans and European settlers well into the 19th century and beyond. Many lost their homes, croplands, hunting grounds, family members, and friends to the Revolution. The Mohawk, who had supported the British diligently without the war, lost nearly all of their traditional homelands and were soon sort of moved into reservations. The support that many of these indigenous nations had given the British during the war actually was sort of used against them by the colonists as another excuse to displace them. And eventually all of these tribes would lose the majority of their homelands in order to make room for America's expansion and a lot of new settlements in sort of central and western New York. So for central New York, this land was sort of sectioned out into military land grants, which land grants in exchange for military service was not new. Actually, all throughout the 18th century, soldiers, British soldiers, would receive land grants, usually around 200 acres, for their services in British regiments. In July of 1782, legislature was passed, sort of setting the boundaries of this land grant for the purpose of sort of honoring those who fought in the war at the time for their service and sort of creating these small sections where they could move into in this state. So such lands were to be provided by the United States, and the expanse of said lands were to be borne by the state in the same proportion as the other expanses of the war. And so, for example, colonels at that time would have been given about 500 acres, lieutenant colonels 450, majors 400, captains 3, lieutenants 200, and ensigns 150. And then non-commissioned officers and soldiers were also eligible to get about 100 acres of land here in New York State. Simon DeWitt, this gentleman right here, who was the Surveyor General of New York at the time, was in charge of surveying about 108 million acres of land, establishing various townships within. So he divided these townships into 100 equal lots of 600 acres each. Except when bordering a body of water, then he did the best he could. So 94 lots in each township were to be deeded to the soldiers, while another 6 were reserved for public purposes, like churches, schools, and town meeting halls. These townships were at first numbered 1 through 28, but were later given mostly classical, traditional names, Greek and Roman names, as well as English names and some with Haudenosaunee influences. So when you think of the name Rome, for example, Syracuse, Cayuga, Canandaigua, all of these were sort of influenced, and the names themselves is actually attributed to a man named Robert Harper, who at the time was a clerk in the office of Simon DeWitt. And it actually took them several years to survey the land, not only because it was a lot of land to survey, but other reasons, including complications with claims from other states, confusions from errors in surveying, squatters, land difficulties, and lack of agreement when it came to this law interpretation. It actually wasn't until July of 1790 that the first land balloting took place, so about 8 years later. And actually at this point, very few soldiers that received these grants actually went and took those lands. Not only had a good number of them died at this point, but they had either already relocated their families out of state or had little money or desire to leave their homes where they had settled to move to upstate New York. And for many of the officers who received greater portions of land, a lot of the lots could have been divided by many miles. So you would have had 1 acre of land, and then a couple hundred miles away you would have had another. So they weren't really that linear. This is actually an image of the upstate military land tract showing these portioned out plots of land. And I'm going to be talking about the Bayard Land Company, which is a big company that ended up taking over sort of the bottom half of this Junius plot here. So present-day Seneca Falls is, present-day Seneca County is on the most westernmost points of the New York military land tract. So sort of what I show you right here. So both the mixture of the Junius tract and the Romulus tract. And Seneca Falls lies right in the Junius tract in the south. So it is believed that in all of Seneca County, only about 3 or 4 men possibly settled on the plots of land they received for their duty. But the lack of sort of these grants did not stop the Bayard Land Company from taking their claim around what is now known as the Seneca River. In September of 1791, 4 men, Mr. Watson, Mr. Van Cortlandt, Jeremiah Van Rensselaer, and Stephen Bayard reached the area where Seneca Falls is today while on their way to Albany along the waterway. And the area around Seneca Falls was part of Junius Lot number 100. So this next photo here, this is actually an image of the northern part of sort of Seneca Falls as we know it today. So they would have come along this waterway here, and they saw the prospect of using some of the sort of rapids they saw in this waterway in order to sort of use them for water-powered mills, which would later attract more settlers to the area. And they even envisioned a canal being made on this river around the rapids. So, in between 1792 and 1816, the Bayard Land Company, as they went to call themselves, consisting of Watson, Cortlandt, Van Rensselaer, and Bayard, bought multiple lots surrounding the falls and river, around where Seneca Falls would be today. In 1795, this gentleman up here, Wilhelmus Miners, he ended up buying into this land and is actually considered one of the founding fathers of Seneca Falls today. But before he became one of Seneca Falls' founding fathers, he came to the area as sort of an on-site agent for the company. That way, if anybody had any problems with the plot of land that they were sold, or if there was any problems with the mills that were in town at that point, he would sort of be that point person for the company. And not only that, but he actually built himself a log house that he used as a residence and store. Bayard Land Company in total owned about 1,450 acres of land around the Seneca River, and with that controlled the water power as well. This control, however, actually inhibited the growth of this area. Not only did they sort of put a price on the usage of the water, but they heavily restricted local enterprise as well. So if you wanted to build something in this area, you needed to go directly through them, and you were paying a very steep price to do so. So in 1825, due to personal financial difficulties with some of the partners, the company was then divided and its property was sold. So the title of my presentation is Two Men of Enterprise and sort of Capital, And that is actually directly from a poster that was posted around this area, sort of promoting the sale of the land once the Baird Land Company went under. So, as I sort of hinted before, Mr. Wilhelmus Minders up here ended up buying sort of the northern plots around what is today Seneca Falls, and he ended up building sort of the main drag, I like to say, of Seneca Falls. While this gentleman down here, Mr. Gary Van Sackett, he, along with two other gentlemen, Ansel Bascom and Andrew Tillman, actually purchased the southern side. And they ended up building houses and businesses along what is known as Bayard Street today, and sort of built up the southern half of the town. So I like to consider them founding fathers of Seneca Falls as well. So all of these land grants are part of sort of the middle New York State area. So this was a complicated process, but it was not as complicated as Western New York. So before the settlement of Western New York could begin, there were a couple conflicts that needed to be resolved. And the first conflict was conflicting claims of ownership between Massachusetts and New York State. So you can sort of see this beautiful map up here that shows all of the land claims from all of the different states at that time. So sort of Western New York and Erie up here was all claimed by Massachusetts until 1786. And each of these states sort of claimed rights of the territory through charters granted by the colony's English kings. And a lot of this was resolved with a treaty, the Treaty of Hartford. So with the Treaty of Hartford, it was said that a survey would be taken to determine the preemption line, which would begin at the 82nd milestone on the New York-Pennsylvania border and would run due all the way up to Lake Ontario, which you can kind of see right here. So Massachusetts would have the right to buy land from the native tribes that were still in Western New York and could resell all territory west of the preemption line. And in this treaty, so New York State would own all of the territory eastern of this line, but it had the right to govern all of the territory west of the preemption line. So New York State didn't own it just yet, but they were able to sort of have say in that territory. So the area that we're talking about is sort of around the counties of Ontario, Steuben, Yates, and portions of Monroe, Livingston, Wayne, Allegheny, and Schuyler. And shortly after the Treaty of Hartford, and once a survey of the West was complete, Massachusetts agreed to sell its whole land tract to Oliver Phelps and Nathaniel Gorham, who wanted to take the land and resell it to people looking to move into the state. So I do have Oliver Phelps and Nathaniel Gorham on the side here. So Phelps and Gorham were to pay $300,000 to Massachusetts in Massachusetts currency, which, doing the math, would be about 3 cents per acre today, which would be really nice if it was still. And so they ended up buying these rights from Massachusetts, but they also had to go to the Seneca, who were still in this area at the time, in order to buy the land from them. So they went directly to the Seneca, petitioned the Seneca for all of Western New York, and really they only ended up giving sort of the eastern half east of the Genesee River. So this is a really nice map. You'll see this about 10 times in this presentation. So all of this land on the eastern side here, they ended up purchasing from the Seneca. So it was about a third of the tract, and they only paid about $5,000 with the promise of paying an additional $500 per year. So this portion consisted of about 2.2 million acres east of the Genesee River, including what was known as the Mill Yard Tract, which is this small area right here, that Phelps-Gorham actually sort of gave to a man by the name of Ebenezer Allen on the condition that he was to build a grist mill and a sawmill in that area. The grist mill, however, was very far from any potential customers he could have had. There were only 25 families living along the Genesee River, along the bank at that time, and there were no real roads going to the grist mill or to any of the neighboring farms. So the mill never, unfortunately, prospered. But during the next 2 years, both men ended up selling about 500,000 acres at a higher price to a number of buyers. Despite all this, though, things did not go very well. Sales were slower than anticipated, and financial problems soon developed. The market value of Massachusetts money had risen considerably at that time, especially with the organization of a main bank, effectively quadrupling the debt that these two had to Massachusetts. So, both of them were actually unable to make the second out of 3 payments they were making towards Massachusetts. So they ended up faulting on the land. So all of the land west of the Genesee River that was once owned by Massachusetts eventually went back to Massachusetts, while the two of them ended up keeping this small portion of land for a little bit. And after giving back the land to Massachusetts, the land was then purchased by Mr. Robert Morris of Philadelphia. So Mr. Morris right here, he was a signer of the Declaration of Independence and was a financier in the American Revolutionary War. He was essentially if not the richest man in America at that point. So he ended up purchasing sort of about 3.7 million acres of land from Massachusetts, sort of divided into 5 parcels, which essentially contained all of the land west of the Genesee River. And he also purchased the preemption rights to the land as well. So he bought essentially the right to purchase property before selling it to others. And he did so for $333,334.34, about $5.98 million today. If only they could have taken 1 penny off, made it straight race. And he also would later buy the 1.2 million acres that Phelps-Gorham had retained, along with all of the other land in the eastern part of the Genesee River, which he actually paid them between 11 and 12 cents per acre. Unfortunately, with all of this spending, the richest man in America soon was not so rich. He was actually soon pressed by his own debts and sought other purchasers of this land. But before that, he actually kept one parcel of about 500,000 acres for himself in a tract known as the Morris Reserve. So this large strip of land right here. And in May of 1796, he actually sort of put a mortgage on this land to a man by the name of John Barker Church. And once Morris failed to pay mortgage on this land, Church took it over and foreclosed it, and he gave it to his son, Philip Schuyler Church. And Philip actually started a small village by the name of Angelica, New York. So if any of you are familiar with the musical Hamilton, this is the same Angelica Schuyler Church from the musical. So we've got a little bit of the musical in our neck of the woods here. So out of all of the property that Morris had purchased, Besides the Morse Reserve, the land was split between two parties. So first, you had the Pulteney Purchase, which was sort of in the eastern part of the state. Morse actually immediately resold the land to his London agent, William Temple Franklin, to Pulteney Associates. And he sold the land at double the price he had paid. There was one problem though. Non-citizens of the states of the time could not legally hold title to the land. Because of this, the buyers actually sent a man by the name of Charles Williamson to the United States, and he became naturalized in 1792, moving to the area. And in April of that same year, he, along with his partners, paid $333,333. I know. I don't know why there's a lot of threes, but 75,000 pounds. The U.S. Congress at this point had actually passed what was known as the Coinage Act, which established the U.S. Mint and made the dollar its official currency only a week before. So Morse made a profit of over $160,000 on this transaction. And after Sir William Pulteney's death in 1805, this area was then known as the Pulteney Estate. The western side, however, he sold this additional land in December of 1792 and into 1793 to the Holland Land Company. I hope that is familiar to you all. The bankers actually ended up hiring American trustees in the United States to take title to the land because, as we said before, New York State law said that it was illegal for them to own the property directly. And as a side note, for the Holland Land Company, Morse actually went and appealed to the New York State Legislature, sort of helping change this law in order to get more people to this land in order to develop more settlements. And of course, before Morse could give this title to the Holland Land Company, there were a couple necessary steps that they had to go through. First was extinguishing the native claim to the land, and then there was an issue with the first survey of Western New York. So, the Holland Land Company ended up meeting with the Seneca Nation in September of 1797 at the Treaty of Big Tree in order to ask for the land to be signed over to them. The native Seneca were going to receive about $100,000, about $1.8 million today, for their rights of about 3.75 million acres of land. And in return, they would reserve about 200,000 acres for themselves in order to create a small reservation. And the gentleman you see up here, you may recognize him. This is Red Jacket, and he was the Seneca chief who was one of multiple chiefs who attended this meeting. And Red Jacket actually opposed the sale of this land, but a lot of the other leaders felt they had no choice. Rather, they saw their future as one on reservations. So, another issue came with the original survey. So, around the time that Morse bought this land, issues with the first survey were well known. Even the purchase deed even stated that a manifest error had been committed when laying out and dividing the land itself. And while some people blamed it on primitive instruments used by the surveyors, there were allegations of fraud as well. Sort of a description of the survey in 1892 cast suspicion on an assistant surveyor named Jenkins, who was had supposedly altered the survey in order to favor his employer, Peter Rickman. Rickman had previously sought to buy the land directly from the Native Americans, but it was illegal for him under New York State law at the time to buy that land, and his contract was voided by the state. This first survey became known as the first survey. Adam Hoops was hired to lead a new team of surveyors that discovered that the first survey actually erred both the eastern preemption line and the western boundary of the land. So, Maxwell had located the westernmost boundary of the military tract in the belief that the Genesee River ran due north. Rather, he sort of mistook magnetic north from true north. So in this new survey, Hoops established that the western boundary of the mill yard tract included sort of this gore-shaped tract of land west of the Genesee River. Which, let me go back to my handy-dandy map here. This small triangle tract, as it is known here today. And Morris actually ended up returning the parcel to the Haudenosaunee, but he ended up buying it back later on as well to be part of the Morris Reserve. And this second survey was accepted by Simon DeWitt in March of 1795. So, it was in 1801, the Holland Land Company first opened its sales office in Batavia, managed by surveyor and land agent Joseph Elcott. So, this gentleman right here. And after years of preparation, the first land sale was made around 1804. And despite being in the area, there was tension between the company and the residents of Western New York due to the structure of the land sales. So in order to buy land in Western New York, the Dutch investors had instructed for the land to be sold for $2.75 per acre with a down payment of 1/4 to 1/3 of its value. It's a lot of money. And it soon became apparent to all of the land agents in this office that these prices were unaffordable for many of the settlers coming to this area, many of them who were entirely cashless. And eviction was also very difficult to carry out once the land had been settled on. So as a result, conditional sales were made by the agents in this area, including discounting prices, lower down payments, longer mortgages, and sort of a labor trade from the settlers on the company's behalf. So working for the company in order to get the land. Leniency actually earned the company goodwill with many of the settlers in this area for many years. And the company intended to grant some plots of land for people under the condition that they were to establish improvements for different towns and areas, such as inns and taverns, in order to encourage their growth. It was actually around 1839 that the last land in Western New York was sold, and the Batavia office would close. And the company itself formally dissolved around the 1840s, 1850s. Of course, as we know today, we are sitting in it right now, the Holland Land Office still exists, and it is a museum here today. So, this map here, this entire eastern part would have been the Phelps-Gorham Purchase, later the Pulteney Purchase, as I mentioned it before. This entire western part of New York would have been the Holland Land Company Purchase, with the Morris Reserve right in the center. Now, at the Historical Society, I am the researcher, so a lot of people, whenever they're doing research on Revolutionary War veterans, ancestors, they always ask me, how do you research land grants? First off, you have to find out if your ancestor actually served in the Revolutionary War. Some families may have stories of individuals fighting in the war that aren't true. I've actually had one or two individuals come to me saying that they swore that their great-great-great-grandfather fought in the Revolutionary War, but when it came down to actually looking him up on a company register, he was not there. So the family was very disappointed. And once you find out that your ancestor had fought in the Revolutionary War, find out if your ancestor was in the Continental Army or was in a militia regiment. As a helpful side tip, the Daughters of the American Revolution have a free database where you can search online whether your ancestor fought in the Revolutionary War and whether they were in the Continental Army or if they were in just a militia regiment. Militia officers and privates were not eligible for these land grants unless they served in the levies, which was a group of militiamen drafted into Continental service. So only people in the Continental Army really got any of these military land grants. So after you find out that your ancestor did fight for the Continental Army, there is an amazing book online that has been scanned called the Balloting Book, which was sort of the cover-all book that states every single man, that every single Revolutionary War soldier that would have been granted land and whether they claimed it or if a family member claimed it or whether they sold it later on to different individuals. So, that being said, if your ancestor's name is not in this book, then there is a very high chance that they did not receive a military land grant. There have only been one or two mistakes in the book. This book was published in 1825. So there is a couple rare exceptions, but for the most part, it is accurate. And once you find out that your ancestor did own some land with these land grants, I would recommend checking out any local history museums or historical societies in the area where your member's land grant could be. They may have information on the family, and they may have information that you were looking for in terms of your relatives. Though sometimes they can even just give you information about the land itself. And I did mention a couple of free resources down here at the bottom. The Daughters of the American Revolution I did mention earlier. Their website is completely free to go and look up information. Family Search is also another very good website. They have a lot of books, articles, and information on individuals scanned in for free for the public. That is actually where I go to when I'm looking at a copy of the balloting book. They have the entire book scanned for free. And New York State Historic Newspapers. This is my favorite website when I want to look at newspapers. Each of these sort of areas of newspapers are broken down based on county. So you can go to the county and they have a search function where you can search up a name of an individual or a company name, and it sort of pinpoints different areas in the newspapers that have been digitized where that name has been used. So it is very useful, but that is limited to any newspapers that have been scanned. So there may be newspapers in the museums or the historical societies that not have been fully scanned just yet. I know for the Seneca Falls Historical Society, for example, we have a lot of newspapers that are not on historic newspapers that we eventually need to get scanned. They're all on microfiche right now, which is very fun to use. And there are paid services out there as well, like Ancestry, but they cost an arm and a leg, just about. So I always like to promote those three as sort of go-tos if you're wanting to do family history, as well as going to your local historical society, historical museum, or any other historical related areas, like even your local library. They may have stuff as well. Alright, so one more thing. This is a very nice map. You saw this map previously, sort of showing off where the original Haudenosaunee tribes would have lived in New York State. And this map sort of shows not only the Clinton campaign, how far it came into New York State, but it also shows where both the military land tracts were eventually sort of formed, and then where all of the Pulteney's, Morris, and where the Holland Land Purchase eventually came to be. All right, does anybody have any questions for me? Yes.
Initially, you showed a map with the Eries to the very east of the state. Whatever happened to that?
So the Eries?
Yeah, it was a tribe, I guess.
Yeah, so
Assimilated.
yeah, I believe they were either assimilated or they ended up moving more northwest towards the Great Lakes region. I think they ended up moving.
Yeah.
Yes.
I was Massachusetts, the west of New York, the east.
Hmm?
So I was Massachusetts, the west of New York, the east.
Well, originally the west was sort of where Massachusetts had their land claim originally. They had sort of the western part of New York State claimed, while the east was more towards New York. Because New York really at the time of the original colony, sort of like I pointed out, was more of the western parts and all of this. So from the pre-ocean line, everything west, that was originally owned by Massachusetts. So New York State, after the Treaty of Hartford, not only sort of gained control of the rest of the state, but they only got the right to govern. So Massachusetts technically owned the western part up until this purchase by Phelps-Gorham and then later on Morris as well. Yes.
Was the whole state divided up into military tracts that they gave, or just certain sections?
Not really, it was only mainly this section of sort of, I like to call central New York / kind of Finger Lakes region, more eastern Finger Lakes region. So this part of the state was the only part that was divided into these military land tracts. At this point, a lot of people were already moving towards sort of the northern part of the state as well, into Mohawk and Oneida territories. So it was only a small section of the state that was portioned off for these land grants. And then when it came to western New York, that was Massachusetts claimed, and they ended up sort of selling the land directly.
Is that under military tracts? Is that the heading that you would look up to see on that?
So this map is actually from a website on the Sullivan-Clinton campaign.
Okay.
So I took this map and the map from the very beginning because they were very good representations of the land and sort of the Haudenosaunee owning of the land, and later on where all of these land grants ended up coming and sort of forming. Any other questions?
I knew somebody who was a Mohawk Indian, and they were in Canada. So did that extend into Canada?
So when the Sullivan-Clinton campaign was coming through the area, a lot of the Haudenosaunee tribes ended up fleeing. A lot of them, a good portion of them ended up fleeing up into Canada, as we know it as today. And there was actually a group of Seneca and Cayugas that went down south. And as we all know with the Trail of Tears, those groups were actually ended up taken to Oklahoma. So in Oklahoma today, there is actually a very small section of the northeastern part of Oklahoma that actually has a reservation for the Seneca and the Cayuga.
Really?
Yeah. I actually lived in Oklahoma for about 10 years, and I live near there.
You know, they're really spaced out, you know.
Any other questions?
Yes.
What percentage of the military tracts were actually claimed by the people that were given the grant?
I don't exactly remember the percentage, but I know it wasn't a lot. Not only, as I said, people had died at that point, people did not want to move, but a lot of the area within these military land tracts, especially around Seneca Falls, if you know where Montezuma Wildlife Refuge is, that is all swamp. So a lot of the people, they would go to see these land tracts, realize, oh, I'll be living in a swamp, and did not want their lands. Not only that, but as I said before, a lot of people who got larger portions of land, their land sometimes was miles away from each other. So for Seneca County, I know that only 3 or 4 individuals actually claimed their piece of land. The rest of it sort of went up for sale. I can't say exactly for sure about the rest of the land tract, how much was actually claimed and how much eventually just went to sale. Any other questions?
Who was selling that?
Who was selling that land? I believe it would have been New York State at the time.
State?
Yes, the state. Anything else? Thank you guys so very much for coming and seeing me today. It was great.
Now, how did I come to you?
Well, thank you again, Daisy, for that wonderful presentation. It's always nice to hear the Holland Land Company get mentioned in a presentation, especially when I'm not giving, so I like that. But thank you all for coming tonight. Quick little PSA about upcoming events. Our next event will be next Thursday morning, our next Job with Joe. You can come and listen to me talk. I'll be talking about the agrarian opposition to the Holland Land Company. So the settlers fighting back. It's a very interesting time in Western New York. So that'll be at 9 o'clock next Thursday. Then next Friday we have a concert here at 7 p.m. Don Dwyer will be coming and he'll be doing songs from women of the Civil War. So either written by or about women during the Civil War from the 1850s and 1860s. So that should be a lot of fun. Then we're going to be in July. It's hard to believe that. But we'll have our next trivia, which will be July 11th on the Declaration of Independence. So come and check that out at 7 p.m. And then Saturday, July 13th, we have a special event. Painter and sculptor Anthony Terrell, formerly of Batavia, now in New York City, will be talking about his latest project that may make its way up here. But he created 2 very large murals. So he'll be coming and talking about his process with that and talking about his sort of time as an artist as well. And July 20th, we'll be doing an artifact preservation workshop, actually. Our curator, Tyler, will be here to do a workshop on how to better preserve your photos and photo albums. So anybody who's got any of those old photos laying around, you definitely want to come and learn how best to keep them going forward. And July 19th, our next guest speaker, David Riley, also formerly of Batavia, now lives in Fairport, but if you read the Batavian anytime soon, he writes a lot of articles about his time growing up. He wrote a book called Small Town Talk, which is about his time growing up here in Batavia in the 50s and 60s. He's going to be here to talk about those stories and sign any copies of the book if you want, which we do have here at the gift shop. He'll be in town for his 60th high school reunion from Notre Dame. So those are the upcoming events. There's plenty more coming out. Check us out on our website, hollandlandoffice.com, Facebook. We're in the Penny Saver, in the paper, we're everywhere. So, or you can just call me and say, hey, what's going on? And I'll be happy to tell you. So.
There you go.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Have a good night. venture out to the key again.